Like the race between East and West to reach Berlin as the Second World War ended, the Russian vehicles triumphantly crossed into Yugoslavia from their peacekeeping base in Bosnia. The words KFOR, the logo for the Kosovo force, had been hastily painted on their vehicles. From Moscow came the clear warning: Russia expected to be treated like an equal, not a junior partner waiting for NATO's orders.
We're acting on a different understanding. We think the deployment of both NATO and Russian contingents should be synchronized, but they should go into different zones. We've no intention of turning up in the American sector and being told where to go.
Before long, the convoy had reached Belgrade, and new reports that possibly thousands of Russian paratroopers were on standby to be airlifted into Kosovo alarmed NATO still further. The problem is, NATO has already divided Kosovo into sectors: British peacekeepers in the centre and in overall command, Americans in the southeast, a German sector in the south, the French in the west, and in the north an Italian sector, just where the Russians wanted to be. And what has really irritated President Yeltsin is the way Moscow is being sidelined, despite playing a vital part in ushering through the peace deal. For Russia's cash-strapped armed forces, it's yet another Western insult. Even so, this afternoon, Moscow promised its troops wouldn't go into Kosovo ahead of NATO.
They haven't entered Kosovo, and they've given us assurances that they're not going to enter Kosovo, at least not until arrangements have been worked out for their participation under agreed terms within a unified command.
Meanwhile, Serb forces continue their retreat from Kosovo. Some locals waved cheerfully, but further south, telltale plumes of smoke suggested they deliberately left behind them burning villages. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
Mark Leahy is at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Mark, can I talk to you first about this rather bizarre sequence of events with the Russians today? Was NATO wrong-footed by the Russians?
Yes, it was. I mean, they've had very difficult negotiations with the Russians over the status of forces, with the Americans playing hardball in negotiations. The Russians have responded with a startling feat of brinkmanship, sending their troops in there and really catching NATO out, which I think is why you suddenly saw all these hurried preparations. I think there was a concern that the Russians were going to go straight into Kosovo, and probably the British were going to react, or NATO was going to react and beat them to it, especially in the area around Pristina. But they now seem to believe that the Russians will stop outside Kosovo and wait, and they'll sort it out somehow. So the drama hasn't turned into a crisis. But equally, I imagine they're going to be very wary to see what the Russians do.
Very briefly, Mark, there are some reports tonight that we might have seen some kind of conflict between them today. Is that overstating things?
I think it's overstating, but I don't think there's any doubt that there was a very tense clash. The Russians are determined to stake their claim, and therefore they did it in the most dramatic way possible. But the Americans say they've been reassured that the Russians will not go in ahead of KFOR, and that's averted a potential crisis, and it just become another piece of theatre, showing how serious the Russians are.
Mark Leahy, thank you very much indeed. Today's other news for you now. Last year, many parents were refusing to have schools. The university is worried it still can't attract enough students from the state sector and says it's got to do more to change its image.
Okay, so what we're going to do today?
No one from this inner-city school has gone to Oxford for 8 years, even though it sends many bright sixth formers to other universities. A couple of these students may try, but most feel it's not for them.
I would feel quite inferior to them because they have different backgrounds, and there'll be a difference with making friends, so it'd be quite hard.
They won't judge me on the grades I get, they'll judge me on my background, or what school I went to, what jobs my family had.
I think they're after a certain type of person, and I think a lot of us wouldn't fit what they're looking for.
It's partly Oxford's traditional image that deters state school pupils, but it's also the different application procedures and a sense that socially they won't fit in. It's not a question of standards. 2/3 of the top A-level grades are obtained by state-educated pupils, but they get only a minority of places at Oxford. Now the university is to target help and encouragement at those schools which have little experience of sending pupils to Oxford.
The application rate is too low from state schools, and we would like to see a broader mix, and clearly that does mean that we would expect to take people more in proportion to the background of high-flying students as tested at A-level.
A more radical plan to set quotas for students of different backgrounds was discussed, but was rejected by the university authorities. However, there are signs that Oxford's new attitude is already beginning to take effect. This year, for the first time, the university has made more pre-A-level offers to students from state schools than it has to those who are educated privately. Mike Baker, BBC News at Brentford School for Girls.
11 years after he took over the reins,